Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bitcoin and Philosophy's fifth session. It's actually the first session of the second module, and I'm going to pass it on to Nick to begin the seminar. Hello, Nick.
Hi, thanks, Mark.
Go ahead.
Welcome, everybody. Great to see you all. So there is, in theory, a central topic this week, which is Bitcoin and signs. And I'm sure that we'll have opportunity to talk about that. I'm going to only say a very few things about that initially, and see what the kind of lines people want to follow up. And in addition, there's three posts from people on the classroom that are all, I think, extremely interesting. We were introduced to this rather strange innovation called Bitcoin by Dana. That was the first thing to arrive. It comes out of the art world. It's kind of humorous, but I think also it's serious in interesting ways. And there's while I'm totally new to it, so I'm not going to put on some authoritative tiara or anything while talking about it. I certainly think there's stuff to be said about that. Then Laura has sent us a set of points about Bitcoin and science, focusing on the question of zero. And I think this is a mixture of things that I strongly agree with and would perhaps want to even push a little further than Laura's done here in terms of backward. And other things that are really deep and complicated and I think aren't going to be resolved unless by some stroke of cosmic fortune in this particular session, but we'll see how we go about that. And then the last one to come in, also fascinating piece, is a connection to a text from, now these people I recognize a lot, and they are obviously taking this topic seriously. It comes out of this institution related to Git lobbying. I think it's based in Amsterdam, but the writer of this is an American academic, and it's called, I don't know whether you'd say provocatively, for me, in a stimulating way, it's called Bitcoin can be seen as a technical, the thing is called Bitcoin as Politics, Distributed Right-Wing Extremism. And it's also got a lot of interesting things going on in it. I think some of it, to me, is a little bit confused in the sense of trying to do several things at the same time that don't necessarily gel that well, but I'll see what people think about that. It certainly, to me, has a lot to recommend it as a discussion topic. So I think I'll just start off a little bit on signs. And I could say ironically, but I don't know whether it would be better to say predictably, the whole discourse around signs is absolutely mired in massive terminological confusion. It tends to be these different camps with their own specific vocabularies. They don't mesh together very well, and it's very hard, as I think we'll find, trying to talk about it, to really settle on an agreed set of definitions for some of this language. And I think that itself is an interesting issue. But I think it's worth starting off with some of the. There's a tendency of all of these different schools of semiology to want to fix upon a particular aspect of the sign and to try to universalize it and to to get every other aspect of semiotic reality out of this particular characteristic. And so, for instance, in lots of the what we might call continentalist type of discourses, the role of the sign as a signifier has been absolutely foregrounded and treated as the basic principle of the sign, and everything has been sort of folded into that and worked in that way. And so you get these enormously complicated and detailed semiotic discourses that are all based on the life of the signifier and the way that the signifier operates. But if we go back to a point that I think is extremely helpful in articulating things that cross a lot of different traditions, the distinction that is made by Frege between significance and reference, to me suggests that there are these functional axes of the sign that are usefully held apart. And in an absolute nutshell, in applying this to Bitcoin, I really want to say the following thing: that money historically can be usefully approached by both of these dimensions, and I'll say a very, very little bit about them in a second, but that the monetary sign is not deducible or derivable either from sense or reference. That those two things are at work in the sign, in the monetary sign, but they do not actually capture or isolate or explain the function of the monetary sign. And that Bitcoin is helping, I think, to precipitate some clarity on this subject. And I think it necessarily involves the introduction of a third dimension to the sign that is absolutely indispensable for understanding the sign as a currency unit, as a monetary sign. So very quickly, the distinction between sense and reference, as Frege, his famous example is obviously to do with Venus, where he says you've got ways of talking about Venus where you can call it either the morning star or the evening star, and these things have a different sense, but in both cases the reference is to the same thing, which is Venus. So the language operates on these two levels. One is a level to do with significance and association and meaning, and the other level is to do with designation and actually indexing some thing. And as I say, the first of these, I think, has been much more florid in its development within certainly European influenced modes of philosophy. The latter, it seems to me, is much more helpfully approached as a practical thing, because indexing and referentiality in this sense is tied up with addresses, where the address doesn't have to have any significance whatsoever. It simply points you to something else reliably. So, for instance, if you take money as our example, and we try to stick with that, you take an old coin, and the coin has, in more than one sense, two faces. It has obviously two faces as a disk, but it has two semiotic faces that you can isolate. And one of them is saturated with significance. There's all kinds of markings on the sign, on the coin, to do with dates and pictures of emperors and various words and associations that then follow from that coin. All of those kind of things. And it also has a reference that's initially to its own Janus-faced existence, that it tells you that this is a lump of metal of a certain weight and quality. And so with the coin, it really is this Janus-faced thing, that those two things belong together, that in the mint there is this semiotic fusion of sense and reference in the coin, and it refers to itself, but also in its circulation and in its social usage, it has all these significances and associations, some of which are just directly imprinted upon it. The point where it becomes clear that these two things are different is obviously when we get to the stage of paper money, and going back, as I always do, to this fundamental form of paper money as a warehouse receipt for a deposit of precious metal. Now, in that case, again, you can have whatever you like written on the front of this piece of paper, and it will probably be extremely ornate, and you could maybe have biblical quotes from it and all kinds of statements of this kind, brands and trademarks and all of these kind of things. But there'll be a certain element in it, a certain semiotic element, which just points you to an account. And it will mean that this element, this code, need have no significance at all. It doesn't mean anything. It will just be a string of identifying numbers. But it means that it actually connects the note to a lump of metal that is not being seen, it is not being represented in any clear sense, it's just being accessed by an address. So this is like a primordial bank account number, you know, which is also on the same axis of reference or whatever. So the point here is just to say it's not at all to say we want to just scrub this sense reference language away. I mean, it's got a very rich involvement in the history of money. It's very interesting in relation to money. And reciprocally, within these semiotic discourses, there is constant allusion to and metaphorical invocation of money. And people say, oh, in all kinds of ways, language is like money, it socially circulates, it has certain characteristics that seem to be, just to repeat this word, that allude to monetary circulation. But when we sort of become a little bit more specific, and here again, I think our guide coming out of Bitcoin and coming out of this whole project is absolutely solidly the reliable thread is the double spending problem. This is something Laura is talking about in her points too. That there are all kinds of ways that you can signify money and refer to money and use signs in these ways that seem deeply involved with money and are not monetary signs. You know, anytime someone just speaks about money or in a journalistic article refers to money, or even in a journalistic way refers to particular accounts or particular deposits, they're using signs obviously in some way to refer to or to signify money, but none of these signs have monetary value. And the reason that they don't have monetary value, I think, is not hard to see, is because they are not scarce. That in talking about money, one is not sacrificing the future potential to talk about money in exactly the same way. So in all of these types of sign systems, what you are always doing with signs is in fact duplication. I mean, to be super crude about it, but I think not unhelpfully crude. You know, I have a message, and in using signs, you then also have the message. You know, I am duplicating the message. The fundamental semiotic activity is proliferation, duplication. So now you also have the message, but I still have the message. I have not parted with the message. There's not been any kind of commercial substitution such that you now have the message instead of me. And neither of Frege's axes capture this phenomenon at all. You can't get from the notion of sense or the notion of reference to the notion of semiotic scarcity or to the notion of the what from in Satoshi Nakamoto sense is the solution to the double spending problem. The solution to the double spending problem being the condition for the origin of the monetary sign. That even if that problem is still lurking away and there's still people counterfeiting money and there's still people clipping coins, there always has to be a satisfactory solution that at least seems in the interim adequate. Hanging a few counterfeiters, having some kind of restraint on the abuse that can be subjected to coins, that allows a society to say that it has a functional solution to the double spending problem. And it's only in the era of the digital sign, digital money, that these kind of compromise solutions become completely inadequate, and the double spending problem becomes such a crisis that it requires a formal solution of the kind that Bitcoin represents. So there has to be a third dimension to the sign. And I'm extremely unsure about what is the best terminology for this. Personally, I've been using the word that there is sense, reference, and commutation, that the sign has to be commutative, which means not in the mathematical sense, but in the sense of substitution, that if a monetary sign, when passed from one party to another party, ceases to be available to the first party, that there actually has to be an act of substitution, a trade-off. And this is something I think that is not implicit or, as I say, derivable from these other philosophical and semiotic formulations of the nature of the sign at all. It's something else, something that absolutely needs to be added in order to have a functional monetary sign. I think you can see this in the word that could be extremely helpful, except that it's still terminologically very blurry, of a token. Because I think when people use the word token colloquially, they often mean exactly this. If you have a token for a gambling machine, or a token for a vending machine, or some kind of token in some other system of exchange, it's implicit in that idea of a token that if you pass over that token to somebody else, if you engage in a commercial transaction with that token, or if you put it in the machine, you no longer have that token. It's not like a message that you still have even after passing it on to someone else. It's something else. You have sacrificed that token in exchange for something else. And that is why it works as money, because it's scarce. You only have a certain number of tokens, and therefore you have to make trade-offs between the various ways that you could spend this token. You could save it, you could use it for the A, B, or C, but you can only do one of those things. You cannot do some multiple of those different things. Unlike a word that if I use it in one sentence, I can in the next breath use it in another sentence. So a token in this sense is a scarce sign. Now, I don't think, unfortunately, that this is by any means the consensus or accepted or generalized meaning of the word token. I think if you look at the way it's used in a lot of discourses, it doesn't yet have that as an essential defining feature. And I think it's only going to be useful to us if we can accept that when we call something a token, we're saying it's commutative in this economic sense, that it has to be spent to be used. Now, I won't I won't spin that subtle up, but I'll just introduce one more factor that I think is relevant to this, which I think brings us on to some of Laura's problems and some of the other, maybe even all the other issues in these other things that people have sent along, which is talking about codes. And I think talking about codes is immediately much more nailed down. I think that it's much easier to talk about codes in a way that is generally agreed and crosses across different discourses without entering into the same confusions and the same absence of a satisfactory definition. And there are two aspects to a code that I think are really important and are universal characteristics. The first is every code is a mapping between two different series. There is one series of signs that is acting as a code, and there is another series of signs that is being coded. And whichever code you look at always has that factor that is mapping two series onto each other. Whether you're just using it in a modern cryptographic sense, whether you're meaning it in terms of genetic code, whether you're meaning it in terms of machine code, or in terms of this, the Bitcoin process, an absolutely classic code is a hash function. A hash function is absolutely specifically a set of mappings from one series of signs into another series of signs, so that when you hash something, you just map it across from state A to state B according to this exact procedure. And the second thing about a code that I think then brings us into a lot of these issues is that a code is if not with the same universality as being a mapping, with a very high level of universality, a code is a set of instructions. Or I think, to put a bit more warmth into it, you could say commands. So again, I mean, the two most, I think, important codes in terms of their at the core of everything that is happening on this planet is, I mean, the genetic code is precisely where DNA data, just a series of signs that contain a certain quantity of information, when that goes from simply a string of signs to being a code, the genetic code, it's when it actually becomes a set of instructions where it produces proteins. So the genetic code, it's not just that we then have a mapping of one thing onto another. In this case, we have a mapping of DNA bases, organized DNA bases, onto proteins, but we have a set of instructions for the production of proteins. Similarly, obviously with machine code, that we have a machine code rather than just binary data, at the point where we actually are chunking that data in a way that will produce reliable instructions for a machine. And of all the things that might be critical about this, one that I think is really gets us onto the double spending problem, and as I say, the issues that a lot of people bring up here, is that as soon as you have a code, you have a set of instructions, you have the opportunity, you first of all have a certain kind of elementary value. And this is shown, let's take the biological example. In the example of DNA, because there is a genetic code, because just certain lengths of DNA will actually instruct a cell to produce proteins, then something else, let us say non-randomly, because it's the most significant example, a virus, can hack into that code and use it to, in this case, use the cell as a factory to produce viruses. This is obviously what, there's no doubt lots of different discourses you could pursue this in. The one I'm most familiar with is the discussion of surplus value of code that you get into Lersen-Guattari. The most elementary example is the virus. And as I've sort of mentioned very briefly before, I think already with this state of discussion, we have the double spending problem. We have the double spending problem because once we've got this very elementary coding and semiotic apparatus, we have a machinery that is worth capturing. That a virus does not need to produce a body for itself, a true soma. All it is a little packet of instructions, because it can take a body from somewhere else and use that body to produce viruses. And it can do that because of surplus value of code, because code is instructions, because as soon as you have the genetic code, the cell will obey someone feeding the right string of codons into it and telling it what to do. So if a virus tells it what to do rather than the cell nucleus telling it what to do, it will still do that thing. It will still produce proteins in the order that have been requested. I take Deleuze-Guattari's most famous example of this, which is this example of this, they say, the wasp and the orchid. Now this is, I think, relevant because it's when they talk about signs, this is the thing that they always really want to go back to. They want to treat this as the model. If you can understand what's happening here, they think you're really understanding what signs are about. And the wasp and the orchid, they say, is also an example of surplus value of code. How is it working in that case? Well, it's working because a flower has a certain relationship to insects, and like the virus, it wants to hijack a body. It wants to hijack the body of the insect in order to not have to waste resources on its own intrinsic reproductive organs. So rather than the flower finding some way itself to invest expensive resources in transmitting pollen from one flower to another, it uses, the insect will say in this example, the wasp, to do this for it. And just like in the case of the virus, the way it does that is it finds a code, a very specific code in this case, which is the code within the wasp that tells it to respond in a certain way to a certain pattern that will activate its sexual response to this flower. It will think if you have a certain pattern on the flower, the wasp will treat that flower as a wasp of the opposite sex and go through sexual behavior with the flower in such a way that it's covered in pollen, and then when it flies to the next flower, it will spread that pollen and act as the flower's reproductive organs. So there too, the crucial thing is that the flower is operating, the strategy of the flower. The reason there are flowers at all is because the flower has, as part of its environment, this coding system belonging to another species. It can hack that code and produce a set of instructions for the wasp that the wasp will obey and therefore act as an organ for the flower. And so obviously, just rushing through to the most recent stage of this, computers obviously also are susceptible to viral attacks in exactly the same way, because there is machine code. There too, if the computer receives a certain set of instructions, it will do what those instructions are telling it to do. And if those instructions have come from a computer virus, it will do what the computer virus tells it to do, rather than what the operator or owner or whatever of the computer is telling it to do. So the point of all of those examples of surplus value of code is that they're all examples of duplicity in the specific sense that the double spending problem is addressing. The code, the signs that actually activate this process are cheap. The behavior that is being activated is expensive, and so you're getting that expensive behavior cheaply by, rather than building up the entire system, you simply produce the code to hijack the coding function of some other system, whether it is a cell, a WASP, a computer. It's the same thing in its semiotic essentials that is happening in all of these cases, and it's, I think, directly addressed by this question of the double spending problem. Because just to get back one more time to the origin of all of this, in all of these cases, the original code is not securely tokenized, whether in the cell, whether in the WASP, whether in the computer. It accepts this code, which is not tokenized. That means it can be spent multiple times. You know, it's obviously most clearly exemplified again by the virus case, where it can just massively replicate billions of viruses without any kind of limit, and all of those viruses can then infect other cells and turn those other cells into virus factories as much as you like, because the code that the virus is reproducing doesn't have any integrity as a token. The virus is not sacrificing anything or very little to reproduce that code. And so this is what any monetary system at a higher level obviously is. Its condition of possibility is that it excludes inadequately tokenized sign systems. If a sign system is inadequately tokenized, it's vulnerable to exploitation by some other system which will be able to exploit the surplus value of code of that system. In the monetary case, it would obviously be catastrophic almost instantly. Like if a particular loose sign of a Bitcoin could access all the resources that money would normally be able to access without scarcity, without commutativity, that it would see as a sign. You could just replicate the sign, and every time you replicate the sign, you would access the resources appropriate to that sign. Then the collapse of the monetary system is almost automatic and at extremely high speed. So obviously, in this way, and this is, as I say, this is why I think, like Laura talks about the double spending problem going back to the origin of paper money and perhaps before. I think it goes back to the origin of replicating molecules. I mean, I think it's like the fundamental semiological and coding problem is of vast generality. Because wherever you have a problem with surplus value of code, you have an application for the double spending problem. And so it seems to me it's a foundational constituent of any general semiotics that wants to include money as part of its topic. But I will pause at that point at least and see whether there's points of that people want to go off, particularly on this question about Bitcoin and signs, or B, whether one of these three topics that we've been sent by Dana, Laura, and Alex is something that people want to wander into at this point.
Nick, I have a question.
Sure.
My question has to do with, I'm just gonna like address the very last little bit you you brought up, which was about the problem of duplication and money going back to biology, right?
Yeah.
I wonder, how does this map onto the question of crystalline and crystals? Because how does that work when a crystal is formed from basic, very, very big, much more basic than biology, right?
Right.
The set of instructions that causes crystals to come to shape or to existence.
Yes, it's obviously an interesting challenge. I mean, my sort of immediate response is then to say, well, can we find any point of application for the surplus value of code in the case of a crystal?
Yes.
Like, is it possible for one system to hijack instructions in some process of crystallization, or is that not possible? Because it seems to me that is the threshold at which we can then, once we can say, look, this system is simply consistent in the sense that the energy input required by the system is directly tied up to the product of that system. So there's no way that the energy input can be accessed externally, and the code cheaply produced can just be translated across and access these energy resources in some other system. So I'm not then dogmatic about the response to that question. I would really want to know a lot more about crystal chemistry to know whether that is something that imaginably can happen.
Thank you.
I have a couple questions. One of them is really, I'm trying to find, I wrote down exactly what you said, but it had to do with this, I believe you used the term scarcity of,
Yes.
and I think it was with reference to the inverse of something I've been thinking about a lot. So without getting lost, I'll just say I've been working with some people and doing some research on a certain trajectory, a continental trajectory of, I guess you could say, semiotic theory, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Right.
That sort of begins with Levi-Strauss and the notion that there's an excess of signifiers to the signified. And so you get Levi-Strauss, you get Blanchot, you get Foucault. To some extent, some people might put Deleuze in this category. It's a certain trajectory of continental thinking which appeals to this, what has been called empty square. This really, this excess that sort of perplexes and troubles writers like Foucault and Blanchot when they think about language. And what I thought was really fascinating was, I think you were saying the opposite, which is rather than there being excess of signifiers to signifieds, you have a scarcity of signifiers to the signified when we talk about the monetary unit.
You certainly have to produce a scarcity for it to be money. Yes, that would be. I mean, look, one direction that I think we should go in at some point, because it goes directly into this, the paper that Alex sent us. It's by, people probably haven't had a chance to read it, so some of this, it's by David Columbia, and it is interesting. And he particularly talks about deflation in this, which is obviously an extremely closely related issue. If we're talking in monetary terms, inflationary and deflationary dynamics directly address this. I mean, it might be too one-dimensional for what you're wanting to say about it, but one could certainly say that at least in the monetary sphere, the phenomenon excess of the, I'll do some quote marks in the air here, the signifier, is inflation. And obviously dramatized maximally by hyperinflation, where you've got a wheelbarrow full of monetary signs desperately searching for someone who will part with a loaf of bread or a packet of cigarettes in exchange for this psychotic profusion of signs. So, I mean, maybe I should just ask you whether you think that is, I mean, to what extent is that latching onto the same problem?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I have to think about it. So, if I'm understanding you correctly, the very notion of inflation itself, when we're talking about money, you're suggesting could latch on to this, what I'm calling, and I realize I haven't unpacked this or explained it at all, but the empty square, this excess of signifiers. But
it seems to me initially very close, but I'm definitely open to correction. If I'm jumping too quickly into this, and getting too concrete too fast about it, then I can easily imagine that's happening. Obviously, working on this topic, these particularly monetary examples are the ones that come to mind for me first. I mean, are there any particular examples of this empty square phenomenon that you think helped it?
I wish I had the people I've been working with me, because they're much more articulate about it. But I don't know if it does, only because it's really, the essence of it is the notion of a negativity. That there's because when you talk about inflation, the excess still always refers to a token, or maybe it doesn't, because when you talk about, yeah, it does. I mean, there's always a token, but because of course I'm thinking about language now, not money. What I'm talking about. So this notion of an excess does not refer to a token. It is in fact the empty space, the pure symbolic, the purely negative, and it's so present if you look at sort of Foucault's philosophy of language, or Blanchot or Lévi-Strauss, and this excess somehow sort of drives, or is the impetus for language itself, as if there wouldn't be meaning if there wasn't this negativity. So this is, I don't want to belabor this idea because it might be way too tangential, but it's different than, because you're looking at language from, crassly speaking, the analytic perspective when you talk about Frege and the sort of history that's created, and then that but then there's this sort of continental trend too in the philosophy of language, which oftentimes analytic thinkers don't contend with. I think. Whether that's a good thing or bad thing, I make no judgment. But so I just have that in mind, and if I could be more articulate later or in another session, I certainly will.
Sure, we can definitely. Yeah. I mean, I'd only say on this analytic continental thing that I think, and correct me if you think this is not right, but I think the continental aspect tends to be on the sense side of this sense reference distinction, which is then vastly elaborated, and obviously then the absolutely pillar role of Saussurean linguistics in that, and the whole that whole system about systemic production of significance, which I'm not trying to foreclose out of this whole thing. I mean, I think it is predominantly one side of what is now a three-sided kind of set of semiotic preoccupations, and all of them are definitely relevant. I mean, for one thing, again, I should restrain myself from going too far down this particular avenue, but if you say, on these strictly Saussurean grounds, that the meaning of the sign is based on this differential relation, which it is in relation to all the other signs in the whole of the language. So sort of haunting any particular sign is all the other signs that determine it by their absence at any particular moment. Now, obviously, there is a sense where you could try and apply that sort of model to Bitcoin in a way, like in that it's purely quantitative. It's not to do with significance in the same sort of way. It doesn't provide any meaning, except that the total global production of Bitcoin ever, this magic 21 million figure, is obviously absolutely crucial to what any one Bitcoin means. Like if you're saying, strictly speaking, what is the meaning of a Bitcoin on that axis, you're saying it's a 21 millionth of all the Bitcoins that will ever exist. That's what it is. And you can't get to a sort of more basic significance of the Bitcoin than that fact that it is this particular fraction of the whole entire stock of Bitcoins either now or that ever will exist. So it doesn't seem to me that there's some sort of cultural gulf that's preventing some kind of translation activity taking place between these two things.
Yeah. Great.
So possibly taking a slight step back, but I don't really think so. In terms of bridging the gap between Ian, which you were talking about with the empty square, and this sort of hyperinflation or inflation in general as mapping to the excess of the signifier. I mean, I'm just spitballing here, but could we understand the loss of value in a currency as that kind of pure negativity you're talking about? If by pure negativity we mean something that's kind of to some extent of a different ontological regime than the signifier, than that which there is an excess of, because that, pure negativity is not a signifier among other signifiers, right? If we understood that, because at least in traditional theory, it's that inflation is what necessitates the continued circulation of money rather than it just being saved or hoarded or whatever as gold might be, at least in principle. And so if we understood this proliferation of signifiers as dropping all of their value in the sense of ability to uniquely refer or substantively refer to some signified, and as that which, and by that means then drives production of new ways of referring to it and transformation therein, I don't know, maybe that's kind of a mapping where this continuous inflation of signifiers by just sort of invention of new ways of referring to things is what drives the exchange of those for new signifieds, understood as that which you can purchase with money, commodities, something like that.
I guess I'll also take a step back. Let me also take a step back in relation to that, because without wanting this to become some sort of dogmatic principle of everything here. If I can just stick with it a minute and just hypothetically say that we need minimally, for all the things we're going to want to talk about in terms of science, these three different axes. And let's say, because the terminological questions are so pressing, that we can talk about signifiers if we're talking about the Phrygian axis of sense. We talk about indices if we're talking about problems to do with reference. And we talk about tokens if we're talking about monetary signs. So my question then is, can we really deal with this hyperinflationary problem? And well, let's do that rather than just inflation because it's nicer and more dramatic. Can we really talk about that helpfully in terms of signifiers? It seems to me, if we're talking about tokens, it all totally makes sense. Tokens should be scarce. And here you are with your wheelbarrow full of Deutschmarks. They're clearly, the scarcity constraint has completely collapsed. They are not scarce, and therefore they're ceasing to function as money. And it all is coherent. Whatever you then want to say about that makes sense. But I'm not even really sure whether we can think about a wheelbarrow full of signifiers. I don't know whether that's just a metaphor or what really. I would, without, again, knowing really without pretending to any kind of full grasp of the topic that Ian is raising here, it seems to me that something different is going on.
Okay,
if one is
hold on,
talking
hold on.
about
What about
an
cyber?
excess of the signifier. Oh, sorry, you've gone silent, Jake.
Wait, say again?
What about what?
I just
Cyber. The prefix cyber, and it's sort of enormous overusage right now, and there's been various sort of articles written about it, and there's a Twitter account that attaches cyber to everything, a comedy account, and if that's understood, and I think to some extent it is, as driving a need for more and more specific, more finely differentiated or expressive prefixes and adjectives to describe these various things that we're using cyber for. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. That just occurred to me as an example.
No. That's good. That's very helpful. That's very helpful. And it seems to me that is, because we're talking about significance, and so there is a certain kind of proliferation there that is about meaning. And as you say, you stick cyber in front of anything, and there's a kind of inflationary phenomenon at the level of significance or meaning. Definitely, you can see happening. But it's on another axis to the wheelbarrow full of money, isn't it? Because every Deutschmark in your wheelbarrow is completely redundant in terms of significance, isn't it? It's like whatever you agree is the sort of function of a Deutschmark as a signifier. If you've got a million of them in a wheelbarrow, you're not in any way actually augmenting that significance in the slightest. There might be then new significations that come in because it is in a wheelbarrow and all of these kind of extraneous factors. But there is a certain kind of semiotic replication and proliferation in the monetary sphere that doesn't seem to be tractable to this semiotic analysis at the level of the signifier. That just seems to be operating so much on another dimension that you don't get any purchase by taking that as primary.
Yeah, no, for sure, taking it as primary. I was just kind of trying to work out a possible way of connecting them. But yeah, fair enough. I understand what you mean.
Yeah, just all cards on the table. I think, I think this idea of first of all, the empty square for me, it doesn't identify with necessarily an excess. Rather, it's a kind of zone of indistinction, to use a kind of Augambinian type of language. And one could say, for example, in Derrida, it's a zone where the signifier and the signified is just indistinct, that they're indistinguishable. But I just wanted to say in response to Nick that, yes, Nick, I completely agree with you, and this is what I mean by all cards on the table, that maybe this language, and this is what's so fascinating to me, that this trajectory, whether we're talking about Foucault or Derrida or Agamben, maybe doesn't map on to what we're talking about. And to me, that's really, for lack of a better word, profound. And I think the more we can look at the biological, the more we can look at the computer as a kind of analogous biological mechanism, the more we may be able to push forward with the way in which actually we need to develop something else. So,
right.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I think there is a particular, without wanting to localize this too much, we're obviously on one level talking about the academy as an institution, at least as being involved in this, and it has a certain position in relation to science that is interestingly specific, and is perhaps one where the sign as token is going to be systematically under-emphasized. I mean, there's sort of really crass sociological things you could say about it, but there's a certain notion about the kind of symbolic position of the intellectual and of the professional intellectual that puts them in a certain relation to the token as we're understanding it here. That your usage of signs in that role is expected to, in a certain sense, be generous, these notions that it's somehow governed by hard rules of scarcity is a kind of implicit ethical issue, isn't it? I mean, it's like people would not necessarily have said anything specifically about it, but I would guess that it is always actually tacitly there in a certain sense. And there is a set of tacit comparisons being made between different social institutions in relation to their relation to science, in which the lack of the non-centrality of the token in the academic sphere is actually an extremely crucial symbolic factor and a form of social identification. I mean, I don't know whether I'm being a bit too elusive and vague about that. But, I mean, again, let me just for a minute just go totally crass and just say, to the sense that the professional intellectual doesn't think of themselves as a banker, which I think, and I'll go further and say, at every minute of their life, they are not thinking of themselves as a banker with a certain kind of positivity. It's not just that they, if asked, they would say, well, no, actually, I'm not a banker. They would actually, in their continuous function as a professional intellectual, be not being a banker as something that's actually positive and in a way almost conspicuous, precisely because they do not have the tokenistic, in this particular sense, relation to signs. And there's a certain way that you could construct the figure of the banker where every usage of signs was economized. That every word they said, every document they produced, every semiotics exchange is integrated into an economic fabric that was ultimately regulated by these token systems. And the academy is kind of, as I say, I think, sort of overtly not that, and therefore it seems to me natural that it's the regime of the signifier and not some other semiotic dimension.
Nick, can I jump in?
Of course.
Okay. In all of this conversation, one name is missing, and that is Pierre Bourdieu's and language and symbolic power, right? Because he also has an account of how symbolic economy functions. He, as most of people here might be familiar, he's completely against like a Saussurean type of understanding of language, right?
Right.
And he emphasizes this sort of like institutional setting as like an element that, like, he basically, I mean you guys are familiar with what I'm talking about, right?
Just vaguely.
Pardon me?
Just vaguely. So continue.
Yeah.
For Bourdieu, like these semiotic operations should not only be looked at from inside the language, and should be looked at like how Nick was
Sorry, I've lost you there, Mo. Are you still?
I lost you as well.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now, yeah, you're back.
I don't know how far could you guys hear me, but basically for Bourdieu also, like Nick, it's like the institution.
Yeah, that's Mo's gone again, hasn't he?
Oh no, yeah.
That gives them their of how fields of knowledge sort of have this autonomous but related currency issuing power that they bestow upon those who hold certain like a whole certain position of like within the field.
Yeah.
Actually,
I think that's
go ahead.
yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think it's a very good thing to introduce here, because I think Bourdieu is really interestingly liminal figure in this. Actually, I think he's operating weirdly on this boundary between these two different angles on the sign, and if you take a notion of, say, symbolic capital, you can see that it's really on this boundary in a really interesting way. I mean, on one level, you can incorporate it to some extent into this. Maybe I could very crassly say, language of the signifier. And you get someone like Derrida, who's definitely on I would say that side of the fence, very happily using these sort of notions of symbolic capital, of that somehow there are these processes of accumulation. There are certain forms of wealth and power that can be stocked up in sign systems. So it does operate in a way that I'm not entirely clear about, sort of mechanically, on that level. And then on the other level, on the other side, it connects with things that I think are much more unambiguously economic, like credentials. I mean, credentials are tokenized, if they work at all, don't they? I mean, if someone says, I am a professor, then you're in a set of questions to do with trust and credibility and all of these things that are made for the blockchain. I mean, if people believe that someone is a professor, it's not anything to do with the number of times they call themselves a professor. It's not a proliferation of the signifier. It's because of the fact that there is a system of scarcity tied up with the credential, and the credential, which is just being indexed by the statement. You say, I am a professor, but your actual credentials as a professor are scarce. You were only issued your professorship on the basis of certain very specific social processes having been fulfilled, and there's a limited set of professorships, and they can't be minted or proliferated or subject to all of these forms of semiotic inflation. And it seems to me that Bourdieu is between these two sides. There's a Janus-faced aspect to it, that on one level it lends itself to saying, well, what is Bourdieu really saying in terms of, can we formalize it as an economic process? And the other is more on the level of significance, and giving this new dimension to significance to do with the way that produces social distinction and symbolic hierarchy and these forms of prestige.
Thank you.
Not to belabor this, I'll make this quick, but it is interesting in the context of Lacan's whole university discourse, problematic, and his own method of punctuation in the analytic setting. Because I think, in a sense, when someone said something that he thought resonated with whatever gulf was in their ego, and then he just walked out the door and slammed it, in a sense, they were giving out a token that he did not return, and he got paid. So
right.
So in a funny sense, that's I think one way the token manifested itself in the whole signifier chain or its breaks.
Yeah, I mean, that is an extremely interesting whole zone that obviously people have delved into to some extent before, is the fact that psychoanalysis is in this zone of intersection, isn't it? Someone like Lacan, absolutely extreme, because he's both to such intensity. On the one hand, it's a paid service, isn't it? There's a flow of money going to the analyst in return for some service, and you're totally in an economic register there. You know, I expect a certain amount of time or attention, or I mean, it's an interesting question exactly what you're paying for, but I mean, it's an economic transaction that's taking place. And then on the other side, obviously Lacan is being one of the vast, you know, masters of the signifier and entering into these kind of public philosophical languages. So yeah, hugely important.
But if I could just add to that,
sure.
I have a friend who's a rather Lacanian expert, I'll say, and he once said to me, he goes, you know, it's absolutely crucial that you take your patient's money, and not only that, but you charge them absolutely as much as you can. So the reason I'm mentioning that is because you pitch them as being separate and like. But according to my friend, they're totally tied. It's absolutely a prerequisite of the therapy that it costs more, pretty much as much, if not more, than you can actually afford.
Yeah.
Like
If I was unclear
with value.
Yeah, totally. No, I was definitely unclear. It's the junction that I definitely am trying to point to, and the fact that you do have this overcoding in this way. That is open to all kind of readings. I mean, obviously, there's a super cynical reading that is too obvious to even lay out. And then on the other hand, there's a reading that is a sophisticated theoretical reading, or however one wants to say that, where, exactly as you say, I'm accepting money, but only because symbolically and at the level of the signifier, parting with your money is part of this therapeutic exchange, it's part of the transference, and all of these, you know, so there's a kind of layering of the process at the level of the signifier over the process at the level of the token, that is open to this kind of multiple interpretation.
Yeah, I don't mean to derail, but it's just fascinating. You know, someone talking and stumbling upon insecurity is the wrong word, but the issue, and to have him just terminate the session and leave them with that signifier, like he got it, they had it, so I guess that exchange happened, but he leaves with the money and they get stuck with the signifier. But anyway.
It is totally fascinating.
But what is fraudulent at the heart of that transaction is the fact that the money paid by the patient to the analyst is sort of like a it's sort of a reverse engineering way of substantiating the value of that of the doubling that happens by the analyst, right?
Right.
That is built into it as a way of sort of like delaying the question of like blockchain and the actual transfer, right? So that's what's fraudulent at the heart of that monetary transaction at the end, right?
Right. Yeah, I just think it's funny.
Yes, I mean, I think the thing is that the language of fraudulence belongs specifically to the tokenistic side of the exchange. I mean, there's this interesting asymmetry to it that obviously, if we look, this is crude, but sometimes crudity is necessary. And if I can just divide the whole world into bankers and academics, and Lacan is in this role of the intersection. Let's say he's fortunate enough to have a banker as his analysand, and at any point he can say, "Oh, you're not getting what's happening here. You're just being a banker." You know, I'm going to dramatize that to such an extent. I'm just going to walk out of the room after 2 seconds and prove what a hopeless banker you are, because I'm I'm on the academic side, and I know it's all about signifiers. And the fact that I'm only spending 2 seconds of my time rather than an hour of my time is not at all an economic issue for me. It's totally to do with significance. You know, there's my analytical process with you is all happening at the level of the signifier. There's no economy to it, and I'm doing this. I'm leaving after 2 seconds in order to break you from your bankeriness and induce you into the superior order of the signifier. Now, obviously, it's at that point that the banker is likely to say that's fraudulent, you know. I mean, but because of the fact that the language is doubled in these two different registers, there's no resolution possible. There's not a common. I mean, Lacan just refuses to credit the tokenistic language of the banker as having any kind of authority in this situation at all. And will always translate it back into saying, oh, you're not understanding the significance of what is happening here if you're going to use this language. And in fact, there's a certain sort of interesting kind of sadomasochistic aspect to Lacan, isn't there, where he's just wanting to actually say, I will break you, you know, I will break you out of this banker mentality you have and force you into the rapture of the signifier. And if that means you pay me for a full session and you get 2 seconds, then that is fine, you know. That's a sacrifice I, as Jacques Lacan, will make reluctantly in order to help you to escape your bankery limitation.
Yeah.
I think it was meant to be Zen, but I'm not so sure it is in the end. Anyway.
I had a question, Nick, about the aspects of the code, or of a code that you were talking about. Specifically, the second one, the algorithm or set of commands, so understanding that set of commands to be either the first series understood as a set of commands that produces the second series, or the set of commands that defines the encoding and decoding, so that operates between them. Like, how do I get ciphertext from plaintext or plaintext from ciphertext? You know, that set of instructions, you know, take your A's and replace them with this and then multiply by that, is a different set of instructions, concretely speaking, than the ciphertext, as literally each sign of that ciphertext being a set of instructions for producing, you know, from which you get the plaintext. And sort of what I'm trying to do is to understand this this set of commands that determines the mapping and its decomposability from, you know, one command, this plaintext means this ciphertext, or vice versa, into several commands that then have, you know, a functional excess as being the basis for the surplus value of code. And so I guess, I don't know, what I'm asking is where you see what set of instructions you were talking about.
Yes, I think that this is the relation between cryptography, which is also the relation of these hash functions in general, or only some hash functions obviously cryptographic, but some are not. Some are just to do with a certain kind of database economization, because when you use a hash function, you basically take an X number of units and put them into a more restrained field on the other side. Yeah.
So you can think of it as a codec would be another.
Compression. Sure. So so when I said that this aspect of the code, that it is instructional, is actually of a lower universality than the instruction that it's a mapping, it's precisely, I think, because of this. I mean, there's going to be a non-linearity in this. Obviously, there will be a set of instructions to perform all of these operations. Hash functions, cryptographic functions, all of these will require computer instructions. But the mapping itself is not something that is giving you a surplus value of code until it is actually giving you control of a machine. I mean, I think I can say with confidence that any example of surplus value of code, there must be machine control, whether it's the cell being controlled by the virus, the wasp being controlled by the flower, the computer being controlled by the computer virus, unless you're actually operating at the level where you actually have effective control over a machine. It's that effective control over the machine that is the value in the surplus value of code. And so, in principle, in a monetary system, in a system of values, you could have any number of displacements, any number of codings and decodings and encryptions that just simply displaced the signs between various levels of plain text and ciphertext. But until you get the level that is actually machine control, you don't have the level that is actually generating value that can be hijacked by some external system.
Right, and so I mean, I used plain text and ciphertext just to start at, I don't know, what I thought of as the simplest, or what to me is the most straightforward level. But so I guess a better example for what we're talking with surplus value would be viruses. So with viruses, your subdivisions of the instructions for encoding are proteins, right, or the transcription of proteins. So I guess what you're saying is that the base pairs that the virus is able to I misused transcription. It's able to transcribe into the genome only gain surplus value of code to the extent that there are decomposable protein translation instructions in that encoding, which have a functional or an excess functional value, which can then become the surplus value of the RNA or the DNA.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the payout is in protein. So the code, it's only at that point that you actually get the economics of it. Yeah, and it's the same obviously with money. Like, even though Bitcoin is a self-enclosed semiotic system in a way, and that, as we've been to over and over again, you go through the Bitcoin paper and it's purely about the scarcity of Bitcoins without specific reference their commercial application. But once again, a Bitcoin fraud, or if anyone was able to in any way hijack Bitcoins, the payout would be in what Bitcoins are actually able to perform as instructions in some, let's crudely say, like energetic medium. It's what you would actually get in terms of, drugs off the Silk Road or whatever it would be. That's the payout.
Can I ask a question just to clarify this point? So basically, you're saying that that the blockchain or Bitcoin as a machine prevents the formation of a surplus value, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And another question.
I mean, can I sort of just say this? I'm not sure. It might be that you would want to rephrase that, because the potential surplus value of code is huge.
Right.
So it prevents it definitely being hacked. Yes. The hacked would be the double spending, and that would be an exploitation of the surplus value of code that, you're right, is being blocked by the protocol. Yeah. That is the solution to the double spending problem.
Right. Okay, thank you. Because I had another kind of question. Because you said before that the double spending basically goes back to the duplication of cells, so to the origins of biological systems, right? So
yes.
I just had this thought, like, it's perhaps, I don't know, quite silly, but I was just thinking, because, so basically, right, if economy is effectively modeled upon physics, right, and I don't know, physical systems. So the question just occurred to me was why would we eventually want to abolish the double spending instead perhaps of harnessing in different ways than, I don't know, the system of the single cell that duplicates the cell. I don't know, I'm thinking about the selfish gene and this sort of I don't know, accounts of biological evolution and these kind of things, because obviously, I don't know, in the system, right, composed by the wasp and the orchid, this system, the surplus, the orchid hijacks the WASP, but at the end
Yeah.
of the day, no one really loses anything, right?
Right.
Like, I don't know.
Yes.
So, yeah,
Yes.
it's just, I don't know.
No, it's to be honest. I mean, this I think is like you open some doors on this question, and it definitely becomes really deep and complicated. I totally agree with you about that. I mean, like there's a crass level. Like if you just go back to the viral example, which is just raw exploitation, it seems, you know. But then you actually go into these bacterial systems, and they use viruses to communicate with each other. And I mean, you know, it's very hard to get to a point, and I would say probably naive, to say that you just can sort of isolate something as a phenomenon of raw, unambiguous exploitation in the system. And I agree, when you get to the stage of like the WASP and the ORCID, it's extremely difficult to do that, you know. And then I mean, all modern biotechnology is just pure surplus value of code ransacking of the natural world. And I'm not meaning that moralistically. I mean, you know, it's like at least potentially a incredibly positive thing, but that's what it is. You know, there's all these sets of instructions and machinic capabilities lodged in these biological systems that biotechnology is just systematically trying to hack and get cells to produce motor fuels or to produce useful drugs or all of this kind of thing. I mean, it's all surplus value of code. But yes, and then on the other side, I think that your question connects up a lot with this other side that you know, we get in with high intensity in this paper that Alex sent us, because it's, for instance, let me just try and very quickly just point to this, because it ties back to this question of inflation or deflation. Like Alex actually quotes some of this paper, and it says the most dangerous kind of value fluctuation is the deflationary spiral. You know, which world currency is currently experiencing one of the most dramatic deflationary spirals anyone has ever seen? Bitcoin itself, the existential threat to the liberal nation state. So it's basically saying, quite rightly, that this project of the production of a sign system that is immune to the surplus value of code can be translated without too much difficulty into this question of inflation and deflation. And in that question of inflation deflation, it's an extremely tractable, although complicated and extremely ambiguous, political economic dilemma. You know, it's very, what you're saying about the cells or the wasps is actually formally and theoretically extremely close in its sort of abstract principles to these questions about deflation getting raised in this political economic sphere, where people would say, isn't the political task actually to finesse the social control over inflation and deflation, rather than to try to exterminate it through this algorithmic mechanism? I think this is what this guy ultimately would say. I mean, I need to look at it more carefully, but I think it's a position not many people are thinking about this yet, not enough in my opinion, but when they do, the dominant left of center widespread critique of Bitcoin will be that will be on these lines. It will be that that inflation is being, in some sense, intrinsically, algorithmically demonized, and instead it's a social potential that we need to maybe adjust our relationship to, even in fundamental ways, but not to disempower.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I haven't read the paper yet, the Columbia paper. I should. Thank you.
So could we understand biotech and Bitcoin both, and then some various other examples, and I just sort of typed this up real briefly in the group chat, as as systems learning to integrate or exploit, like in the sense of taking out of the surplus and into their own pool, the surplus value of code. So in the sense that, I mean, over the history of infiltration by viruses, organisms have, I mean, at least there's a lot of research and speculation lately in this regard, learned various techniques for securing against mutation and also redistributing and sort of directing the effect of mutations and manipulating the translation process of their own genetic code in ways that produce more novelty or more conservation over deep time. Similarly, biotech is learning to take advantage of the surplus value of this genetic code, by living things themselves, us, and then, the things that we create as well. And then in the case of the blockchain, Nakamoto or whoever, we've learned all of this. We've learned all of this about the problems created by trusted third parties, and then of the ways that people exploited earlier hash cache, to pay themselves and pay somebody else at the same time. And then this led to the creation of the blockchain paradigm, as a way to to eliminate those problems and to reintegrate to reintegrate the surplus value into a new encoding mechanism or set of them. Sorry, just kind of rambling there. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm intrigued by this line of talking about it, and I mean, my initial structure of understanding here would be different to that, just because the most straightforward way of constructing it is that Bitcoin systematically eliminates its own vulnerability to hijacking by some other entity extracting surplus value of code. Or in other words, it's impossible that Bitcoin is constructed in such a way that it does not produce surplus value of code to extrinsic parties. But having said that, I'm again not wanting to just dogmatically exclude or deny what you're saying about this. And there is obviously a question, well, if you're thinking about Bitcoin as a new code system, is it extracting surplus value of code, and from what? I mean, I'm not at all eliminating that possibility. It's something I'm not yet seeing, but I mean, it's something I'm open to
well,
seeing.
what about exactly what we started out talking about, which is to say ontological functions of monetarization. So if we think of Keynesian economics as an exploitation of the surplus value of monetary code in order to I guess impose temporal trends or to execute temporal operations on the economy, that the way Bitcoin establishes a history for itself and a new code for constructing consensus or consistent paths for the economy, the reintegration of that function that, I mean, not just Keynesian economics, that was just an example, but that various manipulations of the currency were able to accomplish in terms of an ontological effect.
Yeah. No, I'm definitely open to persuasion about this. I think if you pan out to the most abstract level, if you've got any system that is accessing energy inputs purely through the production of signs, you have to suspect that there is surplus value of code. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari would probably poke you with a sharp stick and say you have to be utterly confident that you there have surplus value of code. And so, obviously, set out on that level of abstraction, it's hard to deny Bitcoin is doing that. When you see these Bitcoin factories, they obviously have massive energy inputs that were not going into this thing before. It didn't exist. And now, human and energy and technical resources are being pumped into this thing of producing and maintaining and running the Bitcoin system. So what has and in what way has this energetic, pre-existing, coded energetic structure been hijacked by Bitcoin? And so I'm saying, without wanting to answer this because I'm not able to answer it yet, I'm just saying I'm extremely open to that being a productive question. And it seems that there has to be a way of going down that road and answering it. Like otherwise, how could Bitcoin exist? How could there be a Bitcoin mining industry? Something has been
without closing that
in
gap
order to do that.
between the abstract and the concrete. Yeah, and it works in kind of the political as well as thermodynamic area as well, because it closes the gap between let's see, what am I looking for? Verification and voting, I guess. There's all of this sort of talk about using the blockchain for digital democracy and consensus about data and about IP rights and so forth. And you could, maybe in this vein, start to see that as a consequence of the narrowing of the gap between economic and political activity, which has also been exploited by various monetary authorities in the past.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, this is again really close to this. Sorry, I keep forgetting the guy's name. This Columbia paper, and the whole way we think about the relationship between the political and the economic is obviously being thrown into a really potentially productive crisis. Productive on a theoretical level, people could lament it or be appalled by it, but in terms of actually forcing us to think about how these things are articulated, it's definitely extremely productive. And he is appalled, and the way he's appalled is really interesting, because what he's appalled about is something that goes so much to the core of what modernity is about. The very notion. I think I don't think he uses this phrase. I'd have to see, but it seems to me what he's about is the politics of depoliticization. So he's saying, and this is the fundamental cognitive orientation of the left. I think in general, it's the most abstract thing, is to say depoliticization is itself a political strategy. And when he says he is talking about the extreme right, I think that's what it means. Is by the extreme right, it means a actually concerted politics of depoliticization, if we're putting it from his side, or sort of at its most extreme, epitomized by the notion of algorithmic government. The notion of a complete extermination of the political, which, of course, from this other side, the side of left critique, they want to say, of course, that is intrinsically massively political. You can't tell us that you want to exterminate politics and then say that that isn't itself a political gesture.
And is that actually something that the algorithmic governance people argue with or find problematic? I mean, at least like I don't know, what exactly is the argument against that being a politics or a political choice, even if it's the very last one?
Right. I would expect there would be some diversity about it, but I think to me it's interesting the term extreme right, what is being said there. And I think if we sort of draw our sort of political spectrum, again, super crudely, we've got extreme left, right, extreme right. And how do you pass in both of these directions to the extreme, And I think the extreme is the place where certain things would be explicitly said, on both sides, that would not be said when you're in the middle zone. Like on this example, he complains about when he says, for instance, let me just give a quote from this paper. He says, enthusiasts demand we understand Bitcoin as a welcome political intervention. But when pressed for details about the political intervention, its advocates unfailingly turn back to technical and engineering matters. Now, this isn't the perfect quote for this point, but it's related. Is to say that this responsible evasion of the issue seems to me to be non-extremist. I mean, the extremist is the position which is to say, yes, the goal is algorithmic government and the death of the political. That's the extreme position, surely. And the moderate position going in that direction is one that is encouraged by those trends and supportive of those trends, but is, for purpose of realistic political compromise, not making them a firm statement. And then as you migrate left to that, it's a tendency to oppose those same processes, but a willingness to compromise with them, that then passes out on the other edge into the extreme left by a absolutely uncompromising denunciation in the name of the political of anything that would compromise with the tendency to algorithmic governments or depoliticization. And I think Bitcoin. Sorry, I don't know what people can hear at this point.
Sorry.
Yeah. Bitcoin compels a crisis. This is what is interesting about it. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about what it's doing, which is to eliminate politics from its own commercial sphere entirely. The people can then, in a supplementary, say, well, it's got all kinds of political potentials that are missed by that. And of course, this Bitcoin thing, I don't know again whether people have seen that, would be an extremely interesting place to look to for that kind of thing. But in terms of the intrinsic Bitcoin protocol itself, it's straightforwardly, simply, unambiguously depoliticized money. And of course, I agree that to say that, to pretend that there isn't a politics of depoliticization is utterly evasive, of course. Did anyone get to see this strange Bitcoin paper?
I followed it. I followed it, and I'm kind of like looking at it purely from the art side of the.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I thought it was extremely interesting. I mean, one thing is that there is it's not a very developed argument, but if you're trying to split up people's positions on this, I've already done this kind of ultras mainstreamers distinction, and it's at an angle to that. It's not quite orthogonal, and it's certainly not perfectly aligned. It's at a slight angle to it. Is a distinction that's tied up with this question of these altcoins. And I say it's at an angle because the mainstreamers tend to be sort of sympathetic. I mean, they're trying to invest in a Bitcoin infrastructure. They like all kinds of economic activity in the area of Bitcoin. They tend to play down the centrality of Bitcoin itself as a currency to the development of Bitcoin. So all of these things place them in a certain position of implicit sympathy with altcoins, whereas the ultras are more inclined to say Bitcoin is so revolutionary that anything that just distracts from it or interferes with its accumulation of network effects and delays the point where it goes head to head with these fiat currencies and wipes them out. And I've already used this, I think, fantastically interesting term, hyper-Bitcoinization, which I think I'm attributing correctly to Daniel Kravitz. And he says that this is hyperinflation as it affects fiat currencies in the face of Bitcoin. And he glosses it as saying, your money is not wanted anymore. So it's just like the guy with the wheelbarrow full of money. He's got as many Deutschmarks as you could conceivably want to throw at anything, and people are just saying, we just don't want that stuff anymore. It's over. That absolute which hyperinflation is tending to, where there's simply no amount of the currency that has any value anymore. It's becoming absolutely worthless. And so Kravitz is anticipating this in this Bitcoin world. He says, there's a certain point where simply the only thing, the notion that you're going to accept US dollars in exchange for Bitcoins will be absurd. We'll simply be exchanging a real money for useless fake money that everyone is trying to bail out of as quickly as possible. No, I'm not arguing for the credibility of that, or certainly not the time scale of that pronouncement, but it's just to say that because of that position, he hates altcoins. He thinks that they're just delaying this, they're just distracting people, that Bitcoin is the story, and anything distracting from that is getting in the way. But then there's another trend that's obviously very pro-altcoin, and sees this as this ecological efflorescence coming off blockchain technology that should be welcomed, and all these interesting things could happen. And maybe if the Bitcoin model is that it's just being driven by network effects to this position of being like a singularity where it's the only global currency, then the opposite extreme is an altcoin economy where everyone has their own altcoin, or maybe several, that altcoins are just something that get massively proliferated, and we're in this strange monetary world where there are, countless money systems. So rather than being concentrated onto this Bitcoin catastrophe, we're instead being pushed into this strange new world of all these currencies being produced, as in this example, as an art project. I mean, that people have the capability to do it, the kind of software is there, and you can just produce a whole currency as something tied up with a particular project you're trying to undertake, as a certain artwork in itself, as a certain form of sort of self-economization. I mean, it's hard to kind of quite get a purchase on what what this kind of weird, tropical, feverish economy would be like. But this is certainly an extreme example of that. Whether rather than asking people for money, rather than engaging in art commerce in a traditional way, she just produces a whole new currency that is her artistic value monetized on this blockchain technology. So I thought definitely that was pretty interesting.
This picture that you just painted, then, the thing that I've been worrying about was something that I think Laura brought up before, this idea that there is a kind of rigidity to the blockchain as a signifying system, as a production of temporality. It's hard to see where novelty can arrive if you can't have mutation. And it might work in terms of tokenization, but it doesn't seem particularly interesting, philosophically, maybe. And the picture that you just painted then was interesting because you get this kind of, like you said, this sort of tropical, feverish patchwork of money ecology, which makes you start to think of Bitcoin as collapsing back into a kind of centralization. And I wonder if that's, I mean, that just occurred to me then, but I wonder if there's anything in that it can then be returned to. I mean, if this kind of these hardcore Bitcoin ultras have their way, you just end up with another kind of very rigid, limited money system.
Well, I mean, it would be, if they had their way, it would be an almost perfect simulation of gold in an economic, in an ultra hard money, gold-based system. So, you know, whatever positive and negatives you want to put to that, I don't think it's particularly unimaginable. I think we can imagine it extreme with high fidelity, because it is such a high fidelity simulation of gold. I mean, it's like gold beyond gold, really, and so whatever gold looks like, this is more than that. But it seems to me hard to imagine in the short term that you could really realistically project this singularity where the only money accepted of value anywhere in the world is Bitcoin. I mean, this is what some people are seeing, for sure. And it's like, I mean, I don't, is it, obviously there's certain haziness in this question about what one is asking for in terms of a mutation and these kind of things, isn't it? I mean, money, even the most sloppy fiat type of money, it kind of mutates in certain ways, but it doesn't, I mean, unless you should speak for yourself about that. I mean, do you think that the kind of mutations we're seeing within the fiat money system are attractive, creative mutations? Because they would die. Yeah.
But I'm just concerned about where this kind of like theoretical vision of the blockchain is going. I mean, not in terms of it being particularly positive or negative, but just that it shuts down a lot of possibilities. And it seems to kind of lead into a space where nothing much can happen. I mean, and then what happens when you mine your 21 million Bitcoins? This is actually something, I mean, maybe I should just go do some more reading and figure this out, but yeah, when those 21 million Bitcoins are mined, how does the circulation keep going? Well, is it because of I mean, do people keep mining to get transaction costs for the transactions they're performing for the people who have the Bitcoins? And does that keep redistributing, or, I mean...
It's supposed to be built in that a certain type of transaction servicing will then be routinized, that will guarantee people enough Bitcoins from that to maintain the incentives that the system requires. And honestly, I mean, I couldn't say with confidence how much credibility I put in that. I mean, you know, it's obviously a serious question. What happens at this point? I think the date is 2040, where there's no more Bitcoin mining. And so whether it's produced a new stable incentive platform, because the one it's got is so beautiful, to my mind, maybe that's a kind of highly questionable aesthetic vision, but to my mind, this basic loop of incentives between the miners and the system production is just absolutely exquisitely beautiful, and that will end. And something that I think is going to be more messy by necessity is going to have to replace it. So I don't know. We've got 25 years still.
As you mentioned in another class, Nick, you said that essentially Bitcoin, it's in it. I think you mentioned the term the framework of game theory. Yeah, that basically it's not in anybody's favor to have the majority of of Bitcoins, to use a really stupid analogy on my part, it's not like Monopoly. You don't want to get to the point where you own all the money, otherwise the game is over. And it's not in your interest to win the game.
Yes. Yes, it's very complicated, and obviously it's such a new world that people are just stabbing at it with these very speculative theoretical models. But that does seem to be working out. You know, just by the sheer fact that it would be so, like, again, going back to this this article that I've been referring to that I've sent, it's got this thing where it says, in December 2013, half of all bitcoins are owned by approximately 927 people, such as Fight the Power Revolution, is sarcastic, obviously, as the Winklevoss twins of Facebook infamy among them. Now, obviously, 927 people owning half of all the bitcoins is a sort of small number, but it's not that small a number. It's half, and it's 927 people, and the whole Bitcoin economy is worth $3 billion. I mean, I imagine there's any number of those 927 people who could arbitrarily increase their investment, their stock of Bitcoins. You know what I mean? So I think there's demonstrable self-limitation happening here. You know, like there's the game theory, and then there's the historical fact, and the historical fact seems really clear that people are not exercising an option to massively accumulate. I mean, if we've got 927 people owning half of the world's bitcoins, so half of the world's bitcoins are worth $1.5 billion. Let's say divide that by 100. It's a tiny stake, isn't it? We're talking like something like $15 million as being a chunk or whatever, and some of them maybe have a few more, let's say at the max a few tens of millions of dollars. You know, in a world of multi-tens of billion dollars plutocratic fortunes, we're definitely on that social level not seeing anything of this kind in the Bitcoin ecology. So that to me strongly suggests that this complicated type of economic game theory is working well, and is producing a kind of distributional ecology which, whilst by no means radically egalitarian, is nowhere near the kind of monopolistic outcomes that would be easily envisaged given the scale of the thing.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to the first point of Amy's couple points or questions about the notion of mutation. I don't know if there's much that I could add to the question, but I do think it's interesting to think about another notion I've been thinking about is the notion of an I believe the term is epigenic.
Epigenetics.
Epigenetic, yes, and the idea that that the DNA, so to speak, can be there, but in the way in which there's growth from out of it, you can have unexpected potentialities realized, which are not necessarily determined by the DNA. But with the blockchain, of course, we don't want mutations in this sense. We don't want epigenetic processes. We want it to do exactly what it's supposed to do, which is protect. Right? Keep its traces perfect. But where we want mutation is in the nonlinearity and the complexity of the economic system outside of the blockchain.
Yeah. So I mean, I agree totally with what you're saying here, and I think that one very useful analogy of this is to the internet. You know, the basic internet infrastructure is fairly simple and extremely consistent. So these few basic protocols that govern all internet traffic are, you know, you could just put them on a few sheets of code. I mean, they're not they're not elaborate. They're hopefully not mutating. No one wants HTML or IP or any of these things to sort of start going on a random walk, because then the system will fragment in a way that is like non-communicative. It will just simply go into isolated packets, and you can't build complexity on top of it. So this notion of there being a few very stable rules as a condition for this complication and elaboration at another level, I think, is really crucial.
Cool, thanks.
But on that analogy, that could be the blockchain as a system, and then a complete economic ecology of different alternative coins.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah,
that's
for
when
sure,
complexity.
for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why this coin thing has become this suffix, hasn't it? I mean, this is one of the things actually I wanted to sort of introduce in this whole science question. I mean, the word coin has been thrown back into instability as a sign is itself an extraordinary thing. I mean, it's this old, apparently extremely determinate word. Everyone thought they knew what a coin was. You know what I mean? It's almost a kind of example of a banal, unproblematic word. And now, literally, what is a coin? In this blockchain sense, it's become a complete boundary of the unknown, what a coin is and can be. And it can, and this is where all this proliferation, variation, experimentation, all of this happens in the fact that no one knows what the limits of a coin are or what it can do or all the different things. I mean, just example, like we now have Bitcoin. I mean, okay, I don't honestly know exactly what it's doing, but I mean, it's the fact it exists is this fact that what a coin is now radically been reopened.
Well, it's equity, isn't it? I mean, as long as like you add the fact that in principle you can exchange the 25 square inches of print for equivalent money, whatever it's worth.
Yeah,
I mean, you're buying equity in her future production. So it kind of circumvents the whole, no credit functionality in Bitcoin problem by, narrowing the field of exchange down to one person that you can, evaluate trust with without going through third parties, and then for that gives you temporal extension.
Yeah.
Well,
maybe.
from the position of the art, I think Bitcoin is even more problematic than what you were describing, Jake. And I think it's a way of gesturing towards it's like one of those desperate attempts by a contemporary artist to make the production sort of like legitimize it and make it relevant to larger social, economic, political happenings.
Are you? I know this isn't necessarily the level to respond to that, but just out of curiosity, are you saying that in a critical mode, Mo, or just descriptive? I mean,
descriptive. I mean,
right.
Critical mode. Of course, descripting can be interpreted as critical, right? But really, there's nothing to critique because the Bitcoin mode of artistic production does not even have the ambition to take over. Like, it doesn't propose itself as an alternative to the way art is sold or bought or symbolic value is produced in the art world. It just offers itself as another way of an artist's career being evaluated in this whole like art world symbolic economy.
Right. Yeah.
Well, right, but I mean, it also, in principle, extends far beyond just the art world. I mean, unless, that's not necessarily true depending on how we define the breadth of the term art world, obviously. But, you know, as we move, as a lot of people think, and I am one of them, think that we will, you know, away from this idea of careers and professions that most people have, you know, at least in sort of the educated, technologically enabled sectors of society, to more, you know, multidisciplinary project and contract or contract work oriented. You know, you are a personal corporation that acquires capabilities and does various things and has a value. You know, this could apply to anyone. You know, what is the value of an hour of my time on an average over a year or 10 years?
Yeah. I mean, there was a trend that got a lot of attention at one point of people, they tended to be kind of already established celebrities releasing bonds based on their own
really
career potential.
This is already happening?
Oh,
Sorry?
yeah. David Bowie did that.
Yeah. That's right. There was at least him, yeah, for sure. So you could buy a Bowie bond, yeah. And already in that, but I think this is going to be much more, again, to use the same sort of word, a kind of feverish process because it's so much more dynamic. It's following a certain trend in the world of art, isn't it? Where the artist and the boundaries become very uncertain, and like, what is the art in Bitcoin? I mean, is the art simply, if we're going to use this signified language, which falls apart at a certain point, but has some mileage? I mean, is the art the signified and the Bitcoin just the signifier for that, or the switch axis just index for it, or has the art, crept out into this whole thing? So its monetization has become the art. That its kind of auto monetization is now the art, and actually the kind of initial material, the initial artistic material, is just a pretext for a certain kind of weird economic commercial performance art that Bitcoin itself instantiates much more highly than the actual original inches of artistic material that are supposedly backing it.
Well, then we have kind of have to distinguish between. Sorry, go ahead, Mo.
No, I was going to say there's this, but what you're saying, Nick, is from the point of view of the outside of the art world, like literally and figuratively, right? You're outside of the art world. But from the inside of the art world, there's another operations happening that it's equal, if not actually from the standpoint of the inside of the art world, is probably more operational or more important, which is this artist is the first one, or among the first group of people who's actually monetizing Bitcoin in the symbolic order of the art world itself. So she's the one, or he's the one, who's bringing this into the art world, and therefore extracting value for being the one who's bringing the whole discussion or like the practice of Bitcoin into the art world.
Yeah. I mean, that crosses a whole bunch of things we've been talking about today, for sure. Like, if we were going to look at those Bourdieu categories in this term, it's extremely complicated, isn't it? What's happening here? Like, there's a certain, as you say, symbolic prestige or originality that is somehow then built into this Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's back to we're back to scarcity again, right? We're back to scarcity again.
In the sense that not everyone can be first.
Yes, because in the art world, and when I talk about art world, we're talking about like the sort of the kind of like virtues and practices that inform the world of art's worldview today, right? In today's art world, it's only the first person, or the first group of people who do these practices that count as art. If this actually becomes a prevalent mode of artistic production, then it's not art, it's craft, it's kitsch. it's just like, you know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
it's like all the other people who copied Banksy. They're not gonna get like
Yeah.
get shows. Banksy will
Yeah.
get shows because he was the first person who kind of like, or he was among the first group of people who basically thought about like street art as a medium of intellectual, like serious intellectual exchange or something.
Yeah.
The rest of the people are just copying Banksy.
Yeah.
They're like we're back in the same stuff that we talked about, right? They're just like making doubles.
Yeah. No, totally. In fact, there's a very nice systematic progression from the basic Bitcoin protocol where only the first transaction is real and the blockchain is a machine for systematically selecting out all non-original transactions as not being recorded on the blockchain and therefore being exempted from reality as defined by the blockchain. So there's that, first of all, absolutely fundamental orientation to originality at the heart of the Bitcoin protocol, to then Bitcoin as a currency having as its only claim to superiority over all these other altcoins is its primarity again. You know, Bitcoin was the first blockchain currency, and that's why it's Bitcoin, and this whole discussion is about Bitcoin and philosophy and not Dogecoin and philosophy or Litecoin and philosophy or any of these other things. Just by being first, it's in this extremely critical position, and it's really hard to overemphasize how important that simple priority is in a world that is totally in this structure of war with double spending. You know, because anyone can just clone the protocol and set up a cryptocurrency. There's nothing about it that it has other than its path dependency, its originality, its primarity. You know, the fact that it's dated first and therefore has these network effects and is able to build initially this power of incumbency is all it has against these competitors. And then third, as you say, then this artistic appropriation that's exactly on the same, you know, replication of this same pattern, isn't it? To do with originality, where only the original has value. And so it's in that way extraordinarily suitable project. You know, that sort of that issue of the primal and the original is just then cuts through on all of these different levels right back.
Thank you.
So that seems to kind of connect to your comment, you know, about Brian Rotman and the function of zero as enabling, but I guess also kind of in this case preventing double spending. Or I mean, okay, that's actually too much, but so this establishment of a firstness which is independent of cardinality. Because like double spending isn't just two, right? It's really to the end. So it's the ability of something to proliferate and duplicate endlessly. And this firstness function preserves something that's independent of all of that and gives it priority over the whole, you know, quantitative proliferation of what it otherwise is to begin with. I'm not sure how that relates to the function of zero because I also haven't read the Rotman book and the comments were kind of attenuated. But Laura, if you do you see those as being related?
I mean, yeah, actually, I think, as you say, it's true. Like the zero sort of establishes a firstness that pre-exists any material sort of foundation. But on the other side, the way that I saw it is kind of the opposite. Is that the zero itself kind of produces this doubling of the subject. Rotman refers to obviously mathematics, but also to arts and aesthetics. So starting from the this um, development of perspectival,
Yes.
I don't know.
It's really
and
good,
thing.
actually, isn't it? The vanishing point.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Starts from the vanishing point, and then with the evolution of mathematics, of algebra, and also of paper money. In fact, paper money that is by itself not it's not backed by gold basically already. I think in the Renaissance, late Renaissance, I guess, so like 17th century or something like that. I think he was referring to. So basically, even in like Rodman was sort of like mapping these parallelisms in between the development of, for instance, a perspective in which at the beginning you have the vanishing point, which is external to the painting, and then you have. And then the vanishing point sort of becomes internalized, so the perspectival point becomes internalized, and that's where you have paper money, which reproduces itself, and then you get to the last stage that Rodman analyzes, which is the sort of, I guess, that book, it was written in the late 80s, so he was talking about like euro dollars and basically financial currency, how what he calls like xeno money, how this money that creates its own value by the possibilities of its own future. So in itself, I mean, what I think the book is pointing towards, from my understanding, my interpretation of it, is this idea of like double spending, or like doubling becomes more and more radicalized, like the doubling of identity, the doubling, it's an identity that, and a doubling of a subject that in a way it sort of works by itself. It's automated, really, in a way. So I don't know whether this really answers your question, because I guess what it's pointing towards, really, to me, is this like kind of automation of like a doubling process. But I don't know.
Right, no, that definitely makes sense, because that's exactly what happens in the construction of digital numeric representations, right? Is that having 0 allows you to double count all of the other numerals. And so that's a form of compression versus like Roman numerals, for example, which is what allows algebra to work. I'm trying to like take this further and like relate it to firstness, and I'm not quite there yet.
Yeah. I need also to do some more digging. I mean, I really enjoyed Rotman's Zero book a lot, but this whole Xenomoney discussion is something that is not there for me at the moment. So I definitely need to spend a week having some
read it as well, but yeah.
We have about 15 minutes left from the session, if you want to be exact with time. And not double it. No, I'm kidding.
Okay. Oh.
Yeah.
I actually had a question, but I guess I'll wait for Laura. Do you mind if I ask it quickly?
No, yeah, go.
Okay, so this relates to like much earlier on, right? And you know, like the way, Nick, you were talking about language, it totally undermines and destabilizes. So like the first order of cybernetic thought of information exchange, right? And because we moved away from the conversation, it's hard to kind of like remember what part of it I'm referring to. So I have to like make a little reference. Is the fact that, so if by communicating with you, I pass on the like, you know what I mean, the way first order of cybernetic theorized what is the nature of information, the ontology of units of information. It's totally not like the way we're talking about it in terms of like money, because of how communication I read accounts of it that people who were discussing how this should be theorized, they did not agree with each other, right? But Norbert Wiener's account kind of like was the one that adopted, right? Which basically separates the bodiless, immaterial information about something and that thing as being the sort of like the a priori or some kind of a given, right? And that way they kind of like basically by adopting this, they did not have to deal with the issue of proliferation, because if communication is just sort of like a reference to
Right.
like a if an electromagnetic signal is just a reference to a thermodynamic reality, I'm just like using like, then it's okay because it's not doubling.
Right.
Because that thermodynamic reality always stays outside of this information network, and it's always kind of like out there, and this sign can go around, and everybody in the world can update themselves about this thermodynamic reality through this electromagnetic signal, and then everything's going to be fine. But we are learning now that it's not going to be fine, because this doubling has ramifications. Ramifications that like the first order of cybernetic did not really comprehend or adopt. If I'm reading it right.
No, I think that's totally right. I think that the Deleuze-Guattari critique would just be about organicism. Don't you think, Mo? That like for Wiener, the object of study, whether organism or machine, is treated as this organic unit that is involved in some kind of semiotic, nonlinear process for its own stabilization. But the notion that it's within some hybrid system in which code is being hijacked and redirected and overcoded is completely outside that framework.
Yes, totally. So Laura, sorry, I stole the mic from you, but you can go ahead.
No, don't worry. I just had a very simple question. I was actually went back to have a look at the Columbia paper, and I realized that I had started reading it, but I think I got up to page 3, and then he gives his definition of money that to me was totally, I don't know, not correct, so I kind of left it. But anyway, so basically, okay, Columbia defines money as a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a measure of value. Okay, I don't think that, as far as I understand it, and as far as, I don't know, even Wikipedia goes, money is not a measure of value properly, but a unit of account. Right? So, and this is why the open ledger is like a great innovation, because it allows for this system of accounting that is in fact open and transparent. But I was wondering about, like, I don't know, how does the function of money as a store of value that could also be questioned eventually relate to the I don't know, is there any relationship with the surplus of value that we were talking about before and the function of money as a store of value? Or perhaps it's not, like, I don't know.
Yes, it's an interesting question. I think if you come at it backwards from the most monetized contemporary forms of money, it's easier to answer. And then the question is how systematically we'd move that back. Because I think in the recent form, it's precisely immunization against these forms of hijacking that allow it to function as a store of value. That's the way the logic goes, and were it possible that because in a way there's this virtual store of actual machinic value. If you have a store of value, it's because you can make a certain number of things happen in the world. If it's just people giving you food and services, or simply, or through with large stocks of money to vast industrial projects, the world can actually be subject to a system of machinic commands
because that's the surplus
by your wealth. And so if that can be extracted by some external party, then of course you've got a bad store of value. You know, you wouldn't store that machinic potential in a form that was open to being raided by these various other parties. Now, if you then want to try and move that back, you know, through monetary history and down into these more archaic semiotic systems, I think it would be, you know, I don't have a kind of formula that will allow that to happen straightforwardly. But just to say, the relation, I think, is clearly there because of the fact that it works so clearly in the final stage.
Yeah, because I've been thinking about, I don't know, in the Nakamoto, I mean, the Nakamoto paper, for instance, it never really refers to value in terms of, like, you know, economic value. It refers to value in terms of, like, I don't know, the hashing value, or the, you know, like algorithmic kind of like value. So and I know that there are some critiques, for instance, of like this definition of money as a store of value as well. There's this Italian economist, Massimo Amato, but also Greg Scott, who writes at like that Sweet Possum. He had a little post not long ago about one of these myths about money that needs to be debunked is, in fact, the idea that money needs to function as a store of value. So I was kind of, I don't know, I'm just trying to understand if there is any relationship in
could you just like very briefly give me a sense of how this critique of the idea of money as a store of value proceeds? I mean, is it to simply say that you can do everything you need just with the notion of it as a medium of exchange, or what's the?
I guess, I don't know. Yeah, I guess this kind of critique works in the direction of, yeah, money is a medium of exchange and a unit of account, in the sense that obviously, if I give something, if I give you something, if we have a transaction, you know, it needs to be recorded somewhere. We need both to have like a token eventually that says, but especially Brett Scott critique, I think, is related to the fact that value anyway is still like a socially constructed. It's socially constructed, and it resides not in the object that is exchange, but in this like belief eventually that this object has a certain value that this token is able to equate it.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know. I just find it interesting, but yeah, I don't even know. Really.
I mean, obviously, like, to get back to the kind of hyperinflation question, the easiest way of understanding what's happening there is that money collapses as a store of value, so that when money loses that function, you simply want to move it out as quickly as possible, because holding on to it is a form of extreme economic sacrifice. So, I mean, I'm open to the possibility that you can run that another way, but it certainly seems intuitively plausible that the fact that money has a value as a store of value is the only thing that would ever incentivize people to hold on to money rather than eliminate.
Yeah,
well, I mean, time preference, just like wanting to have the ability to exchange in the future, you know, just like taking as a given that your ability, your point present ability to produce value to exchange varies over time, is not certain. Then, I mean, it just seems as if like there's no intrinsic problem with projection into the future of medium of exchange as a grounding function.
But isn't if money has the reliable future function as a medium of exchange, is that not a store of value?
Store of value.
I mean, I can't. It seems to be simply. I'll be interested. If you've got links to this stuff, Laura, I'll definitely be interested to have a look. I'm not getting it at the moment because it just seems I can't imagine money not needing to be a store of value, but be interesting to see it.
there is this really interesting talk by this Italian economist, Massimo Amato. He's been working on this form of money that he calls utopic money, with a EU topic. It's, I don't know, well, he's into like local currencies, but I've been thinking about the possibility of extending like his, I don't know, his logic to perhaps something like global universal, like a blockchain system. And he has this really great talk. It's in French. I don't think there's that much like material in English. There's obviously like things in Italian, but I post it. I don't know. Like it's really interesting in the sense that he draws on the system of exchange of the fairs in Nantes in the Renaissance or something like that. I don't remember well, but it's based on this idea of like a form of money as a medium of exchange and a unit of account that doesn't necessarily need to be like a store of value. And again, I don't know how that could eventually be implemented in, I don't know, in practical terms, but I just find it like a really interesting concept, because again, the moment that money doesn't need to represent the value, and it cannot store value, we wouldn't have problems such as inflation again, right? And we wouldn't have like issues of well, obviously, I don't know, accumulation, because why do you need it to keep it always, right? I don't know, I'm just I don't know, I just find it interesting, like this possibility out there. I don't know if
it sounds fascinating, but I can't pretend to have got to first base.
I post something.
Getting it yet? Yeah.
So. Nick, going back to a term used from the very beginning, but we haven't really hit much, which is transcendence.
Right.
So, would you understand like the value that is stored in money, which is also the surplus value of of everything that people might have that anybody else wants, as its exchange value is a surplus value of objects as commodities? Would that be a kind of immanence of all of these things to each other? Is that which constitutes, or could we describe the surplus value of things, which becomes the value of money, as immanence, or money as a transcendent representation of the actual immanence or radical immanence of all the things that enter the economy to each other?
Well, now what's the best way of approaching this thing? I mean, okay. I think in deciding how to apply this language, obviously one is applying a whole machine of critique to a certain problem. So if you were to formulate it in the sense that you've just done, then that would be a critique of money, structurally and formally speaking. So if I can sort of translate what you're saying, it would be to say, wouldn't a critique of money go like this? That there is this field of immanence represented by these stores of energy and all of this kind of thing, and money is the transcendent element in that arrangement. Because as soon as you say that, you're saying that you're already configuring it that so the bypassing of money is in that way implicit. Now, therefore, I think it's, of course, that is something that could be explored, and I'm sure there must be people who have explored it, and they're a kind of a program based upon the abolition of money. There must be, those things must exist, and some of them at least must try to construct themselves as rigorous critique. So I'm sure those things both.
I didn't mean really, so I guess I kind of misused the language a little bit. I didn't really mean in terms of attempting to bypass money. I mean, certainly not practically and not really even theoretically either, but to understand what Bitcoin is doing as purification of transcendence and moving from trusted third parties as identifying transcendence with these particular parties. They're not transcendent. You know, they don't execute like perfect trusted behavior. They're entities in the world. To Bitcoin, which is a more purely sort of concrete, existenceless. Both in terms of, you know, decision making, you know, and reliance on concrete decision makers over its transaction function and so forth, and that this corresponds to that transcendence is Bitcoin's transcendence is, I guess, like more direct isomorphy to the immanence of things to each other, of things that we might want to exchange.
Well, I think that the most straightforward way of doing this with the paper is to say, you could certainly say Bitcoin is transcendental in the sense that it's the actual formal system for this whole projected commercium. But what is transcendent in this model are the third parties. In calling something transcendent within the whole tradition of critique, you're saying it can be subtracted. Those two things are exactly the same. You're already implicitly projecting its subtraction.
So I should have been saying transcendental instead of transcendent.
Yeah, I think so.
So prior to the monetary critique of Bitcoin, then we would describe the trusted third parties as transcendental, right? Which is kind of what I've been assuming all along. But
transcendent,
yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
So I guess my main question was about just, I guess, the immanence term, because that hadn't come up yet. Yeah. But would you agree that that sort of function, that is, I don't know, I guess, non-problematically can be slotted in to this framework we've been using, this terminology?
Yes, totally. I mean, the immanence is the complement of the transcendent in that it's defined by survival after the subtraction of the transcendent. So in the Bitcoin paper, the plane of immanence is defined by these peer-to-peer, this fabric of peer-to-peer relations, obviously whose monetary code is now Bitcoin, and those peer-to-peer relations is everything that remains after, at least in theory, the subtraction of all of these third-party institutions. So if you want to, you know, that actually is a definition, a sort of practical definition of the immanent economic field as it is planned out in this paper. It's what survives the subtraction of transcendence. So everything that is left after all of these intermediary third-party institutions are swept aside, at least shelved in theory, is your immanent plane.
Well, is that transcendental or immanent? And that's also sort of the other question, was the differentiation between the field of people engaging in transactions and the network of people verifying them.
Well, the transcendental is coextensive with the immanent, and it's that part of immanence that is always already present in any. I'm using language that various stages of the transcendental tradition has discarded, but it's the ineliminable element of the immanent field. So for instance, like what's transcendental in the peer-to-peer relation are all those things that are essential to the peer-to-peer relation universally and necessarily under any circumstances.
Transaction announcement, block mining.
Yes, I mean, it will be interesting to exactly define it. Obviously, in the Bitcoin terms, in the future, it's basically the Bitcoin protocol,
right,
with the elements that it necessarily needs to introduce. The notion that there are agents, there are Bitcoin accounts, you know, elements that whatever the particular transaction would always be involved. And as I say, abbreviating that to the Bitcoin protocol itself is basically fine. So the Bitcoin protocol itself is the transcendental element that is therefore always operative in any particular relation. But then any particular agent is part of this, it operates on this immanent plane, but it's empirical rather than transcendental because it can be deducted without problems. Like any particular node can be gone, any particular account can be shut down, any, you know, bitcoins can actually just be vaporized into hyperspace. So any of these particular elements that are flat peer-to-peer elements, they're not transcendent elements, they're not third-party elements, but they're deductible just because they're empirical. It's like if you go back to the internet and take this, okay, it's crude, but it's not unreliable basic thing coming out of this military technology designed to survive a nuclear war. So you have this original ARPANET and DARPANET sort of security infrastructure for military communications under conditions of extreme military stress, nuclear attacks. Now, the transcendental element of that is the whole system itself. It will be the protocols, the transmission protocols, and the fundamental specifications of the network as such, which would apply universally and necessarily to all the nodes of the network. But any particular command center or node on the internet is empirical because it can be taken out by a nuclear strike and the system will still carry on functioning. So that's that. So this is the material construction of transcendental philosophy that you get in all of these networks. Any sort of true flat network system is a critical system in a philosophically recognizable sense.
So,
and Bitcoin. So just the last final thing is just to say Bitcoin is very much like this internet for money in that, you know, you can nuke any nodes out of Bitcoin. It's designed, like he says, it's loosely organized, that there are no components of the network that are indispensable.
right.
You can obliterate a whole bunch of accounts and the Bitcoin system will still keep functioning, just like the internet after a whole bunch of military command centers have been nuked will still keep functioning. So that's how the transcendental and empirical side of the plane of immanence are distinguishable from each other.
Okay, that was a really useful explanation, and it also had kind of a surplus usefulness because does that imply that the invention of ARPANET and the origin of the internet was a form of critique itself within communication, and that it was sort of spurred by the subtraction of physical, reliable physical means or non-digital means of communication by nuclear extinction, sort of the virtual reality or the threat of nuclear extinction?
Yes, I'm absolutely sure that there are elements of the pre-internet system that strictly are isomorphic with the metaphysical as it is defined in Kant, or these transcendent elements that are deducted. And they would take the form of indispensable control nodes. Anything positioned as an indispensable control node, i.e. one that if removed from the system will prevent the system functioning, is now defined as a metaphysical element that has to be deducted from the system for the system to take on the kind of robustness that is required by this military imperative. And that's why the internet is obviously decentralized, and why that, it poses at the very least problems to centralized control. However much people say, well, that's been overemphasized. It's at least when you get this famous comment, the internet interprets censorship as damage and roots around it. That is nuclear war speaking. It's like that statement is purely rooted in the same logic that the military application of the internet was rooted in. And it's to say that it bypasses any element that presents itself metaphysically as an indispensable transcendent authority, because from the military point of view, that's an unaffordable vulnerability.
Okay. And this is another just like slight left turn, but are you familiar with Singularity Sky by Charles Stross with the festival?
Yes, I am, yeah.
So that's another, takes it a step further where it's not just, where it's not just censorship, not even just extinction, but is like the void of space or the non-contact of things itself, the festival views as a metaphysical element that has to be routed through or routed around.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. Stross is always, I mean, I wouldn't say I have no problems with him, but he's always very interesting, that's for sure. You've read, obviously, Accelerando.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Like changed 13-year-old me's life.
Right.
Huh.
Okay, so we're well above the seminar time, 10-minute overtime, which is perfectly fine. The conversation seems to be sort of like flowing. But if you guys have last questions, or if Nick has last remarks, maybe we can kind of like wrap up. Also, I have a request to make, and that's for someone who's been in the room or in the hangout from the very beginning, because I had to leave and come back a few times because I had internet problems, and every time I do that, I lose the sidebar text. So if someone has been in the room consistently, maybe they can select, copy, and paste the whole thing into the
I got you, Mo. I'll post it.
If you can do that, that would be lovely. Because I usually do it, but I didn't get a chance. I can't do it because I left and came back.
Sure. Thanks, Jake. That's great.
Sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, is everyone okay with the trajectory we're on here? I mean, if I treat it that we're going some weird diagonal line between our preset agenda and the stuff people put up on the classroom in time for me to see next week, everyone's cool with that? Or let me just put it this other way. If anyone has course suggestions, I mean course in the navigational sense, just stick them on the classroom. Things that you think we need to talk more about, or that being neglected or gone through too fast, or any such things. Yeah.
Sounds great.
Okay, thanks everybody. That was great.
Yeah, this was a great class, man. So much information.
Extremely. I have to go back and listen to it several times.
Yeah.
True story, same.
Yeah, it's like unbelievable.
Okay, thanks everybody. I really enjoyed that.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thanks, Nick.
Bye.
So thanks for copy pasting the notes, and see you guys next week, Sunday, same time.
Yep.
Yeah.
Bye. Super exciting. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.